The desolate plains of Montana Territory seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the merciless August sun of 1879. As Preston Hawkins rode his exhausted chestnut mare across terrain that hadn't seen rain in over 2 months. His canteen hung light and empty at his side, a cruel reminder that Fort Benton lay still a half-day's ride away if the horse could manage it. Preston Prees, to the few who knew him well enough, pulled his worn leather hat lower to shield his eyes from the relentless glare. 6 years since the war had ended, and he still found himself gravitating toward the frontier, away from the memories of Tennessee and the ghosts of fallen comrades. At 32, the lines around his eyes had deepened, partly from squinting across sun-drenched landscapes, partly from the weight of things he'd seen. A lone buzzard circled overhead, its shadow occasionally crossing Preston's path as if marking him for death. He clicked his tongue, urging his mare forward. "Not today," he muttered, patting the horse's lathered neck. "Not yet, old girl." The rolling hills gave way to a shallow valley, and Preston sensed rather than saw the change in the landscape. Something about the way the wind moved through the grass caught his attention. He reined in his horse, listening. The territorial governor had warned of increased Blackfoot activity in the region, but this wasn't Indian sign he was reading. Then he heard it, faint but unmistakable, the clinking of metal, like chains scraping against stone. Preston's hand moved instinctively to the Colt revolver at his hip. 8 years on the frontier had taught him caution before curiosity. He guided his mare off the trail, approaching the sound from higher ground where he'd have the advantage. When he spotted the covered wagon, his first thought was ambush. It sat tilted at an awkward angle, one wheel broken, the canvas torn and flapping in the hot breeze. No sign of a team, no smoke from a campfire. Just the wagon, abandoned in the middle of nowhere. The sound came again, and this time Preston pinpointed its source. In the shade beneath the wagon, someone moved. He dismounted, tethering his mare to a scrubby pine. With his rifle in hand, he approached in a wide arc, scanning the horizon for any movement. Nothing but prairie grass and distant hills shimmering in the heat. "Hello, the wagon," he called out, keeping a safe distance. "Anyone there?" The rattling stopped instantly. Silence stretched, heavy as a wool blanket in summer. Preston moved closer, rifle ready. "I mean no harm, just passing through to Fort Benton." A shuffling sound came from beneath the wagon, and then a face appeared, a woman's face, framed by tangled dark hair, streaked with dirt and what might have been dried blood. But it was her eyes that stopped Preston, cold, deep amber eyes that seemed to hold an entire world of suffering and defiance. And then he saw the chains. Heavy iron manacles encircled her wrists, connected by links to a larger chain that disappeared beneath the wagon. "Jesus," Preston whispered, lowering his rifle slightly. The woman didn't speak. Those extraordinary eyes simply held his, unwavering, challenging, pleading without a single word passing her cracked lips. "Who did this to you?" Preston asked, moving closer, scanning the area again with renewed vigilance. She drew back slightly, the chains rattling as she retreated deeper under the wagon's shadow. "I won't hurt you," he said, softer now, crouching to appear less threatening. "My name's Preston Hawkins. I'm headed to Fort Benton. There's law there who can help you." The woman's gaze flicked to his rifle, then back to his face, weighing, measuring, deciding whether to trust. Preston set his rifle down slowly, then removed his hat. "You understand English?" A slight nod, barely perceptible. "Are they coming back? The ones who did this?" Her eyes darted to the western horizon, and Preston understood. Yes, they would return. "How long have you been here?" She held up 2 fingers. 2 days. Without water." Another small nod. Preston moved toward his horse, and immediately the woman tensed, chains rattling in alarm. "Just getting water," he explained, retrieving his spare canteen, the one he kept for emergencies. He approached slowly, offering it at arm's length. She hesitated, then lunged forward to grab it, chains rattling loudly. Her hands trembled as she brought the canteen to her lips, drinking desperately. "Easy," Preston cautioned. "Too fast and you'll be sick." She ignored him, gulping until water ran down her chin, then gasping as she finally lowered the canteen. "What's your name?" Preston asked. She looked at him for a long moment, and he thought she might not answer. When she spoke, her voice was rough from disuse and thirst. "Katherine, Katherine," he repeated. "I'm going to help you, Katherine, but I need to understand what we're dealing with. Who chained you here?" She swallowed, her eyes darting again to the horizon. "Slavers," she whispered. The word hit Preston like a physical blow. Slavery had officially ended 14 years ago, but he'd heard rumors of human trafficking operations that had sprung up in the chaotic aftermath of the war. Women and children transported west, sold to mining camps, isolated ranches, or worse. "How many?" "3 men." She pulled the canteen close to her chest. "They'll be back by nightfall. They went to find buyers." Preston's jaw tightened. "Where were you taken from?" "St. Louis. My father died, and I was traveling west to live with my aunt and Helena when they attacked our stagecoach." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, as if each word was helping her reclaim something of herself. "They killed the driver and the guard, took me and another woman. She didn't survive the journey." Preston's eyes moved to the chains, heavy logging chains secured with a padlock at her wrists. "I need to get you out of these. Do they have a key?" "The leader, Burke, he keeps it." Preston checked the position of the sun. Midday. If the slavers returned by nightfall, that left precious little time to free Katherine and put distance between them and this place. "I'll have to break them," he decided, examining the wagon. "There might be tools I can use." Katherine watched him as he searched the wagon's contents. "Why are you helping me?" she asked suddenly. "You don't know me." Preston paused, a question he hadn't expected. He thought of the war, of the principles he'd fought for, of the world that should have emerged from that terrible conflict but somehow hadn't. "Some things are just wrong," he said simply. "No matter when or where you find them." He uncovered a toolbox beneath torn canvas and supplies, sorting through it until he found a rusty hacksaw. It would take time they didn't have much of, but it would have to do. "This is going to take a while," he told Katherine as he returned to where she sat beneath the wagon, "and it won't be easy." Those remarkable amber eyes held his again, communicating a strength that transcended her physical state. "I've endured worse," she said quietly. "I can endure this." Preston nodded and set to work on the chain between her wrists, the saw's teeth scraping against iron with a sound that set his own teeth on edge. "Tell me about your aunt in Helena," he said, trying to distract her from the discomfort. "Will she be looking for you?" Katherine winced as the saw jarred against her wrist. "I doubt it. We've never met. She was my mother's sister, estranged from the family for years. I only have her address from old letters." "You traveled all this way to stay with someone you've never met?" A shadow crossed her face. "After my father died, I had nowhere else to go. The bank took our home. Her letter said she had work for me in her millinery shop." The chain began to give under Preston's persistent sawing, a groove forming in one of the links. Sweat dripped from his brow despite the wagon's shade. "What about you?" Katherine asked. "What brings a man like you to this God-forsaken place?" Preston paused, wiping his forehead with his sleeve. "I've been scouting for the army, contract work, mapping the territory between Fort Benton and the Canadian border. A cartographer. Among other things," he resumed sawing. "I was a cavalry officer during the war, Afterward, I found I couldn't settle in one place for long. The war changed many men that way, Katherine observed, watching his hands work the saw. Her perceptiveness surprised him. "You're young to speak with such certainty about men and war," Preston remarked. "I'm 22, she replied with unexpected dignity. "And I grew up with 4 brothers, all of whom fought. 2 never returned. The others came back different." Preston nodded, understanding both the facts and what lay beneath them. He worked in silence for a time, the link weakening under his efforts. "Tell me about them," Katherine said suddenly. "The men who will return." Preston understood her need to prepare. "How many horses? What weapons?" 3 horses. Each man carries a revolver. The leader, Burke, has a Winchester repeating rifle. The others, Jenkins and a man they call Crow, have shotguns. "And they expect to be meeting buyers here," Katherine nodded. "Men from a mining camp north of here. I overheard them saying there were 20 men there, willing to pay good money for a woman." The chain finally gave way with a sharp snap. Katherine gasped, pulling her arms apart, the manacles still encircling her wrists but no longer connected. Preston immediately turned his attention to the heavier chain securing her to what he now realized was an iron spike driven deep into the ground. "We need to be gone before they return," he said, sawing with renewed urgency. "My horse can carry us both as far as the river. We can follow it to Fort Benton." "And if we meet them on the trail?" Katherine asked, watching the horizon as if expecting to see riders materialize from the heat waves. "Then we deal with them," Preston said grimly. "But I'd rather avoid that if possible. 3 against 1 aren't odds I care for." The larger chain was thicker, the work slower. Katherine found a water skin in the wagon's remains and brought it to Preston. When their fingers brushed during the exchange, he was struck by how cold her hands felt despite the summer heat. "You're in shock," he realized. "How long since you've eaten?" "They gave me hardtack yesterday morning." Preston cursed under his breath. He reached into his saddlebag and retrieved jerky and a handful of parched corn. "It's not much, but it'll keep you going." Katherine ate slowly, methodically, like someone who knew that bolting food after deprivation would only lead to sickness. Preston found himself respecting her self-control, her practical mind. "Were you traveling alone?" she asked between careful bites. "Before you found me?" "Yes." "I prefer it that way." "A solitary cartographer," she mused. "Mapping the wilderness." Something in her tone made Preston look up from his work. Those amber eyes were studying him with intelligence and something else, calculation, perhaps. Assessing whether he was truly her salvation or just another danger in a world that had shown her little kindness. "I was a teacher before my father died," she volunteered, as if offering a trade of personal information might establish trust. "Mathematics and natural philosophy at a girls' school in St. Louis." Preston raised his eyebrows, impressed despite himself. "An unusual position for a woman." "My father believed in education for both his sons and daughter. He taught at Washington University." A flicker of pride crossed her face, quickly replaced by sorrow. "His death was unexpected. Heart failure." Preston nodded, returning to the chain. The link was nearly severed now. "A few more minutes and we'll have you free of this," he promised. The chain separated with a metallic clang that sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet landscape. Katherine immediately pulled her legs out from under the wagon, the iron cuff still attached to her ankles, but the connecting chain now broken. "Can you walk?" Preston asked, helping her to her feet. She swayed, unsteady after days of confinement. "I think so. Give me a moment." Preston gathered what supplies he could salvage from the wagon while Katherine tested her strength, walking in small circles, the shortened chains at her wrists and ankles clanking softly. He found a canteen, some jerky, a box of ammunition that didn't fit his rifle, and a ragged blanket that might offer some protection from the evening chill. "We need to move," he said, checking the sun's position. "We've lost too much time already." Katherine nodded, but as she took a step toward Preston's horse, she stumbled. He caught her arm, steadying her. The contact seemed to startle them both. "Sorry," she murmured, pulling away slightly. "I'm stronger than this. Usually." "You've been through hell," Preston said quietly. "Most would have broken under less." Something flickered in those remarkable eyes, gratitude, perhaps, or surprise at being understood. She straightened her shoulders and moved more deliberately toward the horse. Preston helped her mount, then swung up behind her. The mare snorted in protest at the double burden. "She's tired," Katherine observed, stroking the horse's neck. "Will she carry us both, to the river at least? Then we'll reassess." Preston guided the horse northeast, away from the abandoned wagon, setting a pace that the mare could sustain. "Once we reach Fort Benton, the law can help remove those shackles properly." Katherine's back was rigid against his chest, maintaining as much distance as the saddle allowed. Preston respected her caution. After what she'd endured, trust would not come easily. They rode in silence for nearly an hour, Preston scanning the horizon constantly for any sign of pursuit. The land began to change subtly, more cottonwoods appearing, the grass greener signals that water was near. "May I ask something?" Katherine said suddenly, her voice carrying on the still air. "Of course. How did you come to be a cartographer? It seems an unusual profession for a former cavalry officer." Preston considered his answer. "During the war, I discovered I had a knack for remembering terrain, creating accurate maps from reconnaissance. After, when I couldn't settle, it seemed a natural way to make use of my restlessness. You map the unknown." "Less unknown than it once was," Preston admitted. "But yes, I document what I see so others can follow." Katherine was quiet for a moment. "My father would have appreciated that. He believed in expanding knowledge, creating records for future generations." "A worthy pursuit," Preston agreed. "Yet you choose to do it alone." It wasn't quite a question, but Preston heard the inquiry beneath the observation. "The war taught me that people are unpredictable. Dangerous, even when they don't mean to be. Out here alone, the dangers are simpler." Katherine's soft laugh surprised him. "Until you find a woman in chains under a wagon." Despite the gravity of their situation, Preston felt his lips twitch toward a smile. "I said simpler, not non-existent." The sound of running water reached them before they could see the river, a gentle murmur growing steadily louder as they approached a line of cottonwoods and willows. Preston guided the mare through the trees until they reached the banks of the Missouri River, wide and silver-brown in the afternoon light. "We'll rest here briefly," he decided, dismounting and helping Katherine down. "Let the horse drink and cool off." Katherine moved immediately to the water's edge, kneeling to splash her face and neck. The water darkened her hair to the color of mahogany and washed away some of the grime from her face, revealing features that Preston hadn't fully appreciated before: high cheekbones, a straight nose, and a determined chin that spoke of character beyond her years. She caught him watching and self-consciously brushed wet strands of hair from her face, the chains at her wrists clinking softly. "We need to follow the river northeast," Preston said, looking away to give her privacy. "Fort Benton sits on the Missouri. Once we reach it, you'll be safe." "And you?" Katherine asked, surprising him. What then for the solitary cartographer? Preston hadn't considered beyond delivering her to safety. "Back to mapping, I suppose. The governor expects my report within the month." Katherine nodded, her expression unreadable. She rose from the riverbank, her simple blue dress now torn and stained, dripping water onto the muddy shore. Despite her bedraggled appearance, there was something regal in the way she carried herself. "I owe you my life, Mr. Hawkins," she said formally. "However this ends, I want you to know my gratitude is immeasurable." "However this ends," Preston repeated, frowning. "We're going to reach Fort Benton. You'll be free of those chains and able to continue to your aunt in Helena." Katherine's amber eyes held his, and in them he saw not just gratitude but a clear-eyed assessment of their situation. "They will pursue us," she said simply. "Men like Burke don't abandon their property easily." The word property in reference to a human being made Preston's jaw clench. "Let them try," he said, his hand moving instinctively to his revolver. They rested for only 15 minutes before continuing their journey, following the river's course. The mare moved more easily now, refreshed by water and rest, though Preston kept their pace measured to conserve her strength. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the terrain became more rugged, with bluffs rising alongside the river. Preston guided them to higher ground where they could see the landscape spread out before them. "There," he said, pointing northeast. "See that line of smoke against the sky? That's Fort Benton. We can reach it by tomorrow afternoon if we push on until dusk today and start again at dawn." Katherine nodded, but her attention had shifted to the terrain behind them. "Someone's following us," she said quietly. Preston turned sharply, following her gaze. In the distance, perhaps 2 miles back, a plume of dust marked the passage of riders moving fast. "3 riders," Katherine said, her voice steady despite the fear that must have been coursing through her. "It's them." Preston assessed their options rapidly. They couldn't outrun the pursuers on a tired horse carrying double. Fighting would be risky with the odds against them. Hiding was their best chance. "The river bends up ahead," he said, urging the mare forward. "There are bluffs with caves and overhangs. We might find shelter there." They rode hard for the next mile, the mare giving everything she had left. As they rounded the river bend, the bluffs rose sharply on their right, striated with bands of red and tan stone. Preston scanned the cliff face, searching for any natural shelter. "There," Katherine pointed to a dark recess about 20 feet up the bluff face. "Is that a cave?" Preston nodded. "It's our best chance. Can you climb? With these?" She held up her shackled wrists. "I'll manage." They dismounted, and Preston led the mare to the water's edge, removing his saddle and supplies. "What are you doing?" Katherine asked. "Sending her on," Preston explained, giving the mare a sharp slap on the rump. The horse trotted away along the riverbank. "With luck, they'll follow her tracks and bypass us entirely." Katherine watched the horse disappear around the next bend. "And if they don't," Preston checked his revolver, then the rifle. "Then we face them here." The climb was difficult, especially for Katherine with her restraints. Preston went first, finding handholds and footholds, then helping her follow the same route. The chains clanked against stone with each move, the sound seeming to echo across the river valley. The cave was shallow but deep enough to conceal them if the pursuers didn't look too carefully. Preston positioned Katherine at the back, then took up a position near the entrance where he could see without being seen. "They'll be here soon," he said, checking the position of the sun. "If they pass below without spotting us, we'll wait until full dark before continuing on foot." Katherine settled against the cave wall, her chains arranged to minimize noise. "And if they find us," Preston met her eyes, unwilling to lie to her, "then I'll do what's necessary to ensure your freedom." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a recognition. Katherine held his gaze for a long beat, then nodded once. They waited in tense silence as the minutes stretched into an hour. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the landscape. Preston remained motionless at the cave entrance, rifle ready, watching. "Tell me about your family," Katherine said softly, breaking the silence. "Do you have one waiting somewhere?" Preston kept his eyes on the terrain below. "No, my parents died before the war, no siblings, no wife. No one to miss you if you don't return," she observed. "It simplifies things." Katherine was quiet for a moment. "I think it must be very lonely." Preston had never thought of his solitude as loneliness, it was simply his way of life. But hearing the word from her lips made him consider it differently. "Perhaps," he conceded, "but it's familiar." "Familiarity isn't the same as rightness," she said gently. Before Preston could respond, the sound of hoofbeats reached them. He raised a hand, signaling for absolute silence, and shifted deeper into the shadows of the cave entrance. 3 riders appeared below, moving at a walk now, scanning the riverbank. Preston recognized them immediately from Katherine's descriptions: a large man with a beard who must be Burke, a thin man with a scar across his cheek who matched the description of Jenkins, and a younger man wearing a peculiar hat made from crow feathers. "The tracks lead this way," Jenkins was saying, pointing along the riverbank where Preston's mare had continued. Burke reined in his horse, scanning the bluffs with narrow eyes. "Something ain't right. That horse was carrying double before. Why would they separate?" The younger man, Crow, spat into the dirt. Maybe the woman slowed him down, or maybe he decided she wasn't worth the trouble. "Shut up," Burke growled. "That teacher's worth 500 to the mining camp. We ain't leaving without her." His eyes continued to search the bluffs, and for a heart-stopping moment, his gaze seemed to fix directly on their hiding place. Preston eased his rifle into position, his finger hovering near the trigger. Behind him, he could hear Katherine's breathing, shallow and rapid. Burke finally looked away, gesturing downstream. "Jenkins, follow the horse tracks. Crow, you and I will double back and check the bluffs. They're here somewhere." The men separated, Jenkins continuing along the river while Burke and Crow turned their horses back the way they had come, clearly intending to find a way up to higher ground. "They know we're here," Katherine whispered once they were temporarily out of earshot. "They suspect," Preston corrected. "But they don't know exactly where. That gives us an advantage." "What do we do?" Preston assessed their options. "We need to move. They'll search the bluffs systematically. Our best chance is to circle around them, get back to the river, and continue toward Fort Benton." He helped Katherine to her feet. The cave connected to a narrow ledge that ran along the bluff face. If they could follow it around the bend, they might find a way down on the other side, away from where Burke and Crow would be climbing up. "Stay close to the wall," Preston instructed as they edged out onto the ledge. "Move slowly and carefully." Katherine nodded, pressing herself against the stone face of the bluff as they began their precarious journey. The ledge was barely 2 feet wide in places, with a sheer drop to the rocks below. The chains at her ankles restricted her steps, making each movement a careful calculation. They had progressed perhaps 50 yards when a shout echoed from below. "There, on the ledge." A rifle shot cracked the air, sending stone chips flying near Preston's head. He pushed Katherine flat against the wall, shielding her with his body as he drew his revolver. "Keep moving," he told her. "I'll hold them off." Another shot rang out, closer this time. Preston leaned out just enough to return fire, his revolver barking twice. One of the men below yelled in pain. "Go," Preston urged Katherine, who had frozen against the wall. "The ledge widens around that bend. You'll find a way down." "Not without you," she said, her amber eyes fierce in the fading light. "I'm right behind you," he promised. "Go now, while I've got them pinned." Katherine hesitated for only a moment longer before continuing along the ledge, moving as quickly as her shackles allowed. Preston fired again to keep their pursuers' heads down, then followed her, backing along the narrow path. As they rounded the bend in the bluff face, the ledge did indeed widen into a small plateau. A game trail switched back down from there to the river below. Katherine was already starting down it when Preston joined her. "I hit one of them," he said, reloading his revolver quickly. "But they'll be after us soon enough." They descended as rapidly as possible, Katherine stumbling occasionally when her chains caught on rocks or roots. Preston stayed right behind her, one hand at her back to steady her, the other holding his weapon ready. They had nearly reached the bottom when Burke appeared at the top of the trail, rifle raised. "Down!" Preston shouted, pushing Katherine forward as a shot rang out. The bullet whistled past them, striking a tree trunk with a solid thunk. They stumbled the rest of the way down the slope, half falling, half running until they reached the riverbank. The sun had set now, twilight settling over the landscape and making it difficult to see clearly. "The water," Preston decided. "We can use it to mask our trail." They waded into the Missouri, the cold current tugging at their legs. Katherine gasped as the water reached her waist, but she pressed forward, following Preston as he angled downstream. Behind them, shouts and curses indicated that Burke and Crow were making their way down the trail. Another shot rang out, the bullet striking water several yards away from them with a hiss and splash. "They can't see us clearly," Preston said, "but we need to get across." The river was perhaps 70 yards wide at this point, the current swift but not overwhelming. Katherine nodded, determination written across her face as she struck out swimming, awkward with her chained wrists but managing to make progress. Preston swam beside her, his rifle slung across his back and growing heavier with every stroke. The current carried them downstream as they crossed, putting distance between them and their pursuers. By the time they dragged themselves onto the opposite bank, full darkness had fallen. They collapsed onto the muddy shore, gasping for breath, listening for any sound of pursuit. "They'll have to find a crossing point," Preston said between breaths. "That buys us time." Katherine nodded, too exhausted to speak. Water dripped from her hair and clothes, and in the dim starlight, Preston could see she was shivering. "We need to keep moving," he said, helping her to her feet. "Walking will warm you." They set off through the trees that lined the riverbank, heading northeast toward Fort Benton. The night was clear, stars appearing by the thousands above them, offering just enough light to navigate by. After an hour of steady walking, Preston called a halt. They had reached a small clearing surrounded by cottonwoods, relatively sheltered from view. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he decided. "They won't cross the river in the dark. It's too dangerous." Katherine sank to the ground, her chains clinking softly. "What if they wait until dawn and pick up our trail?" "They'll try," Preston acknowledged. "But we'll be moving again before first light. Fort Benton is less than 20 miles now." He spread the blanket he'd taken from the wagon on the ground for her. Katherine wrapped it around her shoulders, still shivering despite the summer night. "You should sleep," Preston said, positioning himself at the edge of the clearing where he could watch the direction they'd come from. "I'll keep watch." "And when will you sleep?" she asked. "I'm used to going without." Katherine studied him in the starlight, her expression thoughtful. "You've been running a long time, haven't you? Not just from Burke and his men, from something else." Preston felt unexpectedly exposed by her perception. "We're all running from something, I suppose." "What are you running from, Preston Hawkins?" No one had asked him that question so directly before, perhaps because no one had gotten close enough to ask. "Memories, mostly," he admitted. "Things I did during the war, things I failed to do. Easier to keep moving than to sit still with them." Katherine nodded slowly. "My father used to say that the things we run from are the things we most need to face." "Your father sounds like a wise man." "He was." Sadness tinged her voice. "He also said that sometimes courage isn't about fighting battles but about allowing others to help us in our struggles." Preston smiled faintly in the darkness. "Is that your way of saying I should sleep while you keep watch?" A soft laugh escaped her. "Perhaps, though I doubt I'd be much use if Burke and his men appeared." "You've survived this far," Preston pointed out. "That suggests considerable resourcefulness." She was quiet for a moment. "Before you found me," she said hesitantly, "I had nearly given up hope. 3 days alone, chained like an animal. I began to think death might be preferable to what awaited me at that mining camp." "But you didn't give up," Preston said. "You held on." "Because of my father," she admitted. "He always taught us that while there's life, there's possibility. I kept thinking of ways I might escape, even as the chances seemed increasingly remote." She paused. "And then you appeared like something out of a storybook." Preston shifted uncomfortably at the comparison. "Hardly that. Just a man in the right place at the right time. A man who chose to help a stranger at considerable risk to himself," Katherine corrected. "Not everyone would have made that choice." Before Preston could respond, a sound reached them, distant but distinctive. Voices carried on the night air from across the river. "They're still searching," he said, rising to his feet. "We should move." Katherine stood quickly, wrapping the blanket around herself like a cloak to muffle the sound of her chains. They set off again, moving more carefully now in the deeper darkness beneath the trees. The night passed in a rhythm of walking and brief rests, always moving northeast. Katherine's strength impressed Preston. Despite her ordeal, she kept pace without complaint, stopping only when he insisted she needed rest. As the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, they reached a rise that offered a view of the terrain ahead. In the distance, perhaps 10 miles away, the buildings of Fort Benton were just visible, a collection of structures nestled alongside the broad curve of the Missouri River. "There it is," Preston said, pointing. "We can reach it by midday." Katherine's eyes fixed on the distant settlement, hope and exhaustion mingling in her expression. "Freedom," she whispered. They continued as the sun rose, warming the air and drying their still damp clothing. The landscape became more open, with fewer trees for cover, a mixed blessing that made travel easier but left them more exposed if their pursuers had crossed the river. By mid-morning, the fort was clearly visible, growing larger with each mile they covered. Preston estimated they were less than 5 miles away when Katherine suddenly gripped his arm. "Riders," she said, pointing southwest. Preston followed her gaze and saw them 3 horsemen moving rapidly in their direction. They had crossed the river and cut directly across country, gaining ground rapidly. "They've spotted us," he said grimly. "We need to run." They abandoned caution, breaking into a run across the open prairie toward Fort Benton. Katherine's chains jangled with each step, the noise seeming to announce their position to their pursuers. Despite the awkward restraints, she ran with determination, her face set in lines of fierce concentration. The horsemen gained on them inexorably. Preston could hear the pounding of hooves growing louder behind them. He turned, raising his rifle. "Keep running," he told Katherine. "Don't stop for anything." She hesitated, those expressive eyes communicating a world of concern. "Go," Preston insisted. "I'll be right behind you." Katherine nodded once and continued running toward the fort while Preston took up position behind a large boulder, bracing his rifle against the stone. The 3 riders approached rapidly, Burke in the lead, his face contorted with rage, Jenkins and Crow flanking him. Preston took careful aim and squeezed the trigger. The rifle's report echoed across the prairie. Jenkins' horse reared as the bullet struck near its hooves, throwing its rider to the ground. The other 2 riders separated, circling to approach from different angles. Preston fired again, forcing Burke to veer away. But Crow kept coming, closing the distance rapidly, shotgun raised, Abandoning his position, Preston ran to catch up with Katherine, who had covered several hundred yards toward the fort. Behind them, Burke and Crow were remounting, preparing to continue the pursuit. "They're still coming," Preston said as he reached Katherine's side. She was breathing hard, her face flushed with exertion. "We're almost there," she gasped, pointing ahead where the buildings of Fort Benton were now clearly visible. They had just crested a small rise when hoofbeats thundered behind them. Preston turned to see Burke bearing down on them, rifle leveled. "Get down!" he shouted, pushing Katherine aside as a shot rang out. Pain exploded in Preston's left shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to one knee. "Preston!" Katherine's scream seemed to come from far away as he fought to stay conscious. He could hear Burke's horse approaching, slowing to a walk now. "Should have minded your own business, mister," Burke's voice drawled. "Now I've got to kill you and reclaim what's mine." Preston raised his head, seeing Burke dismounted now, standing over him with his rifle aimed at Preston's chest. Beyond him, Katherine stood frozen, her amber eyes wide with horror. "She's not yours," Preston managed through gritted teeth. "She's not anyone's." Burke laughed, an ugly sound. "That's where you're wrong. I paid good money for her after we took that stagecoach. She's property, pure and simple." "The only property here is what you stole," came a new voice, authoritative and hard. Preston looked up to see 4 mounted men approaching rapidly from the direction of Fort Benton, all wearing badges that caught the sunlight. Burke turned, his rifle wavering between Preston and the newcomers. "This doesn't concern you, Marshal," Burke called out. "I believe it does," the lead rider replied, his revolver already drawn. "Put down your weapon, Burke. It's over." For a moment, Preston thought Burke might fight. The slaver's face twisted with rage and calculation. But as the lawman spread out, covering him from multiple angles, Burke slowly lowered his rifle. "This ain't finished," he spat, glaring at Preston. "I believe it is," the marshal countered, dismounting and approaching with handcuffs ready. "William Burke, you're under arrest for murder, kidnapping, and engaging in human trafficking. Your associates Jenkins and Crow as well." As 2 deputies took Burke into custody, the marshal approached Preston, who was still kneeling, one hand pressed to his bleeding shoulder. "You all right, son?" the older man asked, helping Preston to his feet. "I'll live," Preston said, his eyes seeking Katherine. She rushed to his side, chains rattling, her face pale with concern. "You're hurt," she said, examining his shoulder with gentle fingers. "Just a graze," Preston lied, though the spreading bloodstain on his shirt suggested otherwise. The marshal's eyes widened at the sight of Katherine's shackles. "Good Lord, miss, let's get those things off you." He turned to one of his deputies. "Williams, ride back for the doctor. Tell him we've got an injured man, and a woman needing those chains removed." Katherine stayed at Preston's side as they made their way slowly toward Fort Benton, supported by the marshal. The town grew larger before them, a frontier settlement of wooden buildings, boardwalks, and dusty streets that represented safety and civilization after their ordeal. "How did you know to come?" Preston asked the marshal as they neared the town limits. "Your horse," the marshal explained. "She wandered into town last night, still saddled. Made us wonder where her rider had gone. Then this morning, one of our scouts reported seeing men tracking someone along the river. Figured the 2 might be connected." Katherine's hand found Preston's good arm, squeezing gently. "Your mare led them to us." Preston managed a smile through his pain. "Smart horse." They were taken directly to the doctor's office on Fort Benton's Main Street. The physician, a grizzled man named Dr. Hollies, attended to Preston's wound first, cleaning and bandaging the bullet graze while Katherine waited anxiously nearby. "You're lucky," the doctor pronounced. "Bullet just took a chunk of meat. No serious damage. Keep it clean and it'll heal in a couple of weeks." Once Preston was patched up, attention turned to Katherine's shackles. The town blacksmith was summoned with his tools, and after 30 minutes of careful work, the iron manacles fell away, revealing raw, chafed skin beneath. Katherine rubbed her wrists gently, tears welling in her amber eyes as she experienced true freedom for the first time in days. "Thank you," she whispered, looking from the blacksmith to the marshal to Preston. "All of you." The marshal took their statements in his office, recording every detail of Katherine's abduction and their subsequent escape from Burke and his men. By the time they finished, night had fallen over Fort Benton. "Burke and his men will stand trial in Helena," the marshal assured them. "With your testimony, Miss Hall, they'll hang for what they've done. There have been reports of women going missing along the stage-coach routes for months now. You may have helped us break up a major trafficking operation." Katherine nodded solemnly. "I'll testify. Whatever it takes to ensure they can never do this to anyone else." The marshal arranged rooms for them at the town's small hotel. As they stood in the hotel lobby, exhaustion finally catching up with them both, Katherine turned to Preston. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly. "What you did, risking your life for a stranger." Preston shook his head. "No thanks needed. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Katherine said with certainty. "They wouldn't have. Most would have ridden on, telling themselves it wasn't their concern." She studied his face in the lamplight. "You're a rare man, Preston Hawkins." Something in her gaze made Preston feel both seen and accepted in a way he hadn't experienced in years. He found himself wanting to prolong their time together, reluctant to say goodnight despite his exhaustion. "Will you still go to Helena?" he asked. "To your aunt," Katherine considered the question. "I suppose I must. I have nowhere else to go." She hesitated. "The marshal mentioned I should be there for the trial in any case." Preston nodded, trying to ignore the strange hollowness that formed at the thought of their parting. "I need to complete my mapping assignment, but perhaps I could escort you to Helena when you're ready to travel, for safety." A smile touched Katherine's lips, warming her amber eyes. "I would appreciate that very much, Mr. Hawkins." They said goodnight in the hotel hallway, each retiring to their separate rooms. Preston sat on the edge of his bed for a long time, his injured shoulder throbbing dully, his mind full of amber eyes that spoke volumes even when their owner remained silent. For the first time in years, the prospect of returning to his solitary existence felt not like freedom but like loss. The next morning, Preston woke to sunlight streaming through threadbare curtains. For a moment, he was disoriented, accustomed to waking beneath open skies. Then the events of the past 2 days rushed back, finding Katherine, their flight from Burke and his men, the confrontation outside Fort Benton. He dressed carefully, his injured shoulder stiff and painful. When he made his way downstairs to the hotel's small dining room, Katherine was already there, seated by a window. The transformation was remarkable. She had bathed, her mahogany hair clean and neatly arranged, falling in waves to her shoulders. Someone had found her a simple blue dress to replace her torn and stained garments. But it was more than these external changes. She sat straighter, her face composed and serene, though the shadows beneath her eyes spoke of restless sleep. She looked up as he approached, and those extraordinary amber eyes brightened. "Good morning," she greeted him. "How is your shoulder?" "Stiff but healing," Preston replied, taking the seat across from her. "You look rested." A smile touched her lips. "Amazing what a real bed and clean water can do." Her expression grew more serious. "The marshal came by earlier. He's arranged for me to travel to Helena with a merchant convoy leaving tomorrow. They'll ensure I reach my aunt's home safely." "Tomorrow," Preston repeated, feeling an unexpected disappointment. That's good. Katherine studied him for a moment. He mentioned you might be heading in that direction as well once you've completed your mapping work. Preston nodded. My final report is due to the territorial governor in Helena within the month. A comfortable silence fell between them as breakfast was served hot coffee, biscuits, and bacon. Katherine ate with the deliberate appreciation of someone who had known hunger too recently. I've been thinking, she said finally, setting down her coffee cup, about what happens after I reach Helena. Preston waited, sensing she had more to say. My aunt's offer was to work in her millinery shop, Katherine continued. A respectable position, but not one that uses my education or experience. She hesitated. Before all this happened, I had hoped to find a teaching position in Helena. The city is growing rapidly, and surely there must be need for qualified instructors. I'm sure there is, Preston agreed. Your background in mathematics would be especially valuable. Katherine's eyes lit up at his understanding. Exactly. There are mining companies, surveying operations, even the territorial government itself, all requiring people with mathematical knowledge. Preston found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. You have it all planned out. Not all, she admitted, but having a purpose, a direction. It helps after what happened. She met his eyes directly. What about you? Will you continue mapping indefinitely, always moving, never staying? The question struck closer to home than Preston was comfortable with. It's what I know, he said simply. Is it what you want? Preston considered the question honestly. For years, movement had been his answer to the restlessness that plagued him after the war. The open country, the solitude, the constant change of scenery, it had been enough. Until now. I'm not sure anymore, he admitted, surprising himself with his candor. Katherine nodded as if his answer confirmed something she had suspected. Sometimes we follow a path for so long that we forget to ask if it's still taking us where we need to go. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the marshal, who pulled up a chair at their table. Good morning, he greeted them. Glad to see you both recovering. He turned to Katherine. Miss Hall, I've had a telegram from the territorial prosecutor in Helena. They're very interested in your testimony against Burke and his associates. It seems they've been tracking this operation for some time but lacked a surviving witness. Katherine straightened her shoulders. I'll tell them everything I can. The marshal nodded approvingly, then turned to Preston. And you, Hawkins. The governor's office has been asking after those maps of yours. Seems they're eager to expand settlements in the border regions. I'll complete my work within the week, Preston assured him. Just need to fill in some details along the Marias River. Well, don't take too long, the marshal advised. Word is the governor's planning a major push for statehood next year. Those maps will be important for defining territorial boundaries. After the marshal departed, Preston and Katherine spent the day recovering from their ordeal. Preston visited the general store to replace supplies lost during their escape, while Katherine met with the marshal's wife, who had taken it upon herself to ensure the young woman had everything she needed for her journey to Helena. They reconvened for supper at the hotel, where the conversation flowed more easily than Preston would have expected. Katherine told him more about her life in St. Louis, her education, and her hopes for the future. Preston found himself sharing stories of his mapping expeditions, the breathtaking landscapes he documented, the challenges he'd overcome, the solitary beauty he'd witnessed. It sounds wonderful, Katherine said when he described a mountain lake so clear it perfectly reflected the stars at night. Seeing places few have ever seen. It can be, Preston acknowledged, though there are times when having someone to share it with would make it more so. The words slipped out before he could consider them, and he found himself momentarily embarrassed by their implications. Catherine's eyes softened. I imagine that's true of most experiences worth having. As evening deepened into night, they walked together along Fort Benton's Main Street. The frontier town was quiet, most establishments closed save for the saloon, from which piano music and raucous laughter spilled into the night air. "This will be goodbye, then," Katherine said as they paused outside the hotel. "The convoy leaves at dawn." Preston nodded, surprising himself with his reluctance to end their time together. "It's been an honor to know you, Katherine Hall, even under such circumstances." She smiled, the moonlight catching in her amber eyes. "The circumstances were terrible, but meeting you, that part I wouldn't change." An impulse seized Preston, then a desire to suggest that perhaps their paths might converge again in Helena, that perhaps he might call on her when his work brought him to the territorial capital. But the words caught in his throat, held back by years of practiced self-sufficiency. "I wish you a safe journey," he said instead, "and success in finding your teaching position." Katherine studied him for a long moment, as if waiting for something more. When it didn't come, she simply nodded. "And I wish you safe travels, Preston Hawkins. May you find what you're mapping for." They parted in the hotel hallway, each to their separate rooms, and Preston lay awake for hours, thinking of amber eyes that seemed to see straight through his carefully constructed solitude. Morning came too quickly, gray light seeping around the curtains as Preston dressed. His shoulder ached less today, Dr. Hollis's treatment proving effective. By the time he made his way downstairs, the merchant convoy was already assembling in the street 3 wagons loaded with supplies bound for Helena. Katherine stood beside the lead wagon, a small valise at her feet. She had dressed practically for travel in a simple brown skirt and white blouse, her hair tied back from her face. As Preston approached, she turned, those expressive eyes finding his instantly. "I was afraid you might sleep through my departure," she said with a small smile. "Not likely," Preston replied. "I wanted to see you safely on your way." The convoy leader, a grizzled merchant named Donovan, approached them. "We're about ready to move out, Miss Hall. Got you a comfortable spot in the second wagon." Katherine nodded her thanks, then turned back to Preston. An awkward silence fell between them, heavy with things unsaid. "Well," she said finally, "I suppose this is goodbye." Preston nodded, searching for the right words and finding none that seemed adequate. "Take care of yourself, Katherine." She held his gaze for a long moment, then surprised him by stepping forward and placing a gentle kiss on his cheek. "Thank you for saving my life, Preston Hawkins," she whispered. "I won't forget you." Before he could respond, she turned and walked to the waiting wagon, allowing the driver to help her up onto the seat. Preston stood motionless, watching as the convoy began to move, wheels creaking in the early morning stillness. Katherine looked back once, raising her hand in farewell. Preston returned the gesture, standing in the street until the wagons disappeared around a bend in the road. An emptiness settled over him, more profound than any he had experienced in his years of solitary wandering. For the first time, his chosen path of constant movement and deliberate detachment felt not like freedom but like exile. The marshal found him still standing there, lost in thought. "Hawkins," he called, approaching with a telegram in his hand. "Just received this from the governor's office. They're requesting you expedite your mapping of the Marias River. Seems there's some dispute with the Canadian authorities about the exact border placement." Preston took the telegram, grateful for the distraction. "I'll head out today." The marshal nodded approvingly. "Good man. By the way, Miss Hall asked me to give you this once she'd gone." He handed Preston a folded piece of paper. "Safe travels, Hawkins. Left alone again, Preston unfolded the note. Catherine's handwriting was neat and precise, reflecting her mathematical mind. Dear Preston, the words we need most are often the hardest to say in person, so I will write them instead. In the midst of my darkest hour, you appeared and restored my faith in humanity. You risked everything for a stranger, asking nothing in return. That kind of selflessness is rare in this world. But beyond gratitude, I find myself thinking of the man behind the heroism, the solitary cartographer mapping the wilderness while perhaps overlooking the unexplored territories of his own heart. If your travels ever bring you to Helena, please know that you would be most welcome. My aunt's shop is on Last Chance Gulch, easy to find in a town still finding itself. Some journeys are meant to be shared. Yours, Katherine. Preston read the note twice, then carefully folded it and placed it in his breast pocket, close to his heart. The emptiness he had felt watching her leave began to transform into something else, a sense of possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. 3 weeks later, Preston stood before the territorial governor's office in Helena, his completed maps rolled and tied with string under his arm. The capital city bustled with activity, growing rapidly as Montana pushed toward statehood. He had pushed himself hard to complete his mapping assignment, traveling longer days than usual, taking fewer breaks. If he was honest with himself, he knew exactly why he had hurried. After delivering his maps and receiving the governor's thanks and payment, Preston found himself standing on Last Chance Gulch, the main thoroughfare of Helena. The millinery shop was exactly where Katherine had said it would be, a modest establishment with a neatly painted sign reading Hall's Fine Hats. Preston hesitated outside, suddenly uncertain. 3 weeks had passed. Perhaps Katherine had settled into her new life, had no interest in seeing the man who reminded her of her trauma. Perhaps the note had been nothing more than gratitude, not the invitation he had interpreted it to be. As he stood there, the shop door opened and a middle-aged woman emerged, locking the door behind her. She noticed Preston and smiled politely. "We're closing for the day, sir," she said. "But we open at 8 tomorrow if you're looking to purchase a hat for your lady." "Actually," Preston found himself saying, "I was looking for Katherine Hall." The woman's expression changed, becoming more guarded. "My niece, may I ask who's inquiring?" Preston Hawkins. "We met in Fort Benton." Recognition dawned on the woman's face. "Mr. Hawkins. Katherine has spoken of you. Often, in fact." She extended her hand. "I'm Margaret Hall, Katherine's aunt." Preston shook her hand, relief washing through him. "Pleased to meet you, madam. Is Katherine available?" Margaret smiled, a knowing look in her eyes. "She's not here at the moment. She's been offered a teaching position at the new school on Ewing Street. She finishes at 4 o'clock. She glanced at the large clock across the street. "Which is just about now. If you hurry, you might catch her before she starts for home." Preston thanked her and set off toward Ewing Street, his pace quickening with each step. The school was easy to find, a new 2-story building with a bell tower, built to accommodate Helena's growing population. As he approached, the front doors opened and children spilled out, laughing and calling to one another as they headed home. Preston waited, scanning the departing faces until finally he saw her. Katherine emerged from the schoolhouse, carrying a stack of books. She wore a navy blue dress that complemented her coloring, and her mahogany hair was arranged more formally than he had seen it before. She looked happy, confident, a world away from the chained woman he had found beneath a wagon. For a moment, Preston simply watched her, struck by how naturally she fit into this setting, how right she looked surrounded by the trappings of education and civilization. Perhaps this was where she belonged, not with a solitary wanderer who had spent years avoiding attachments. But then she looked up, her gaze sweeping the schoolyard, and stopped when she saw him. Those extraordinary amber eyes widened in surprise, then lit with a joy so genuine it banished Preston's doubts in an instant. "Preston," she said, her voice carrying across the distance between them. He moved toward her, suddenly certain of his course in a way he hadn't been about anything since before the war. "Katherine." She met him halfway, her books clutched to her chest like a shield. "You came," she said simply. "I finished my mapping assignment," he explained unnecessarily. "Delivered the maps to the governor this morning. And then I came to find you." Preston hesitated, then added, "Your note, it made me think." Katherine's smile deepened. About unexplored territories." He gestured to the busy street around them. "About shared journeys." Her amber eyes studied his face, reading him as clearly as he had once read landscapes. "And what conclusions did you reach, Mr. Hawkins?" Preston took a deep breath. "That some explorations are better undertaken with a companion, if that companion is willing." Katherine's smile became radiant. "I believe she might be, depending on the destination, of course." "I'm not entirely sure of the destination myself," Preston admitted. "I've spent so long moving that I've forgotten what it means to arrive somewhere." He met her gaze directly. "But I'd like to find out, with you if you're willing." Instead of answering immediately, Katherine stepped closer and placed her free hand on his arm, the same gesture she had used when they first met, only now it conveyed not desperation but connection. "I think," she said softly, "that would be an expedition worth undertaking." They walked together through the streets of Helena, as afternoon mellowed into evening, talking of her new teaching position, of his completed maps, of the 3 weeks they had spent apart. With each exchanged word, each shared laugh, each glance, Preston felt something shifting inside him, the solitude he had clung to for so long giving way to something warmer and infinitely more vital. As they reached the small house Katherine shared with her aunt near Last Chance Gulch, she turned to him. "Will you come to supper tomorrow? Aunt Margaret would love to thank you properly for what you did." "I'd be honored," Preston replied, "but there's something I need to tell you first." He took a deep breath. "The governor has offered me a permanent position with the Territorial Land Office, mapping disputed areas, establishing boundaries for new settlements." Katherine's eyes brightened with understanding. "A position that would keep you in Helena?" Preston nodded. "I haven't given him my answer yet. I wanted to speak with you first." "Why?" "Because for the first time in years, my decision about where to go next depends on someone besides myself." He met her gaze directly, on whether there might be a reason to stay in one place. Katherine's amber eyes softened. "And if I said I hoped you would stay, then I would accept the position," Preston said simply, "and see where this path leads us." She smiled, a smile that transformed her entire face with its warmth. "I would like that very much, Preston Hawkins." As the sun set over Helena, casting long golden light down the busy streets of a town transforming itself into a city, Preston felt the last of his restlessness fade. For years, he had mapped the physical world while leaving his own heart unexplored. Now, looking into Katherine's amber eyes, he saw territories worth mapping for a lifetime together. 6 months later, on a crisp January morning, Preston stood beside Katherine in Helena's small church, surrounded by a gathering that included her aunt, the territorial governor, the marshal from Fort Benton, and several of Katherine's fellow teachers. As they exchanged vows, Preston marveled at how completely his life had transformed since that fateful day when he'd found a woman in chains beneath an abandoned wagon. Katherine's amber eyes met his as they spoke their promises, communicating as they always had, directly, honestly, completely. Her voice was steady and sure as she pledged herself to him, but it was her eyes that told the deeper story of gratitude transformed into respect. Respect deepened into friendship, and friendship blossomed into love. The territorial governor hosted their wedding celebration at his residence, where he announced that Preston would now head a new department dedicated to mapping Montana's resources in preparation for statehood. Katherine, already beloved by her students, had been asked to develop a mathematics curriculum for all territorial schools. As evening fell and guests began to depart, Preston found a moment alone with his new wife in the governor's garden. "Happy?" he asked, though he could read the answer in her face. "Completely," Katherine replied, her amber eyes luminous in the lantern light, "though I do have one request for our future." "Anything," Preston promised. "Don't ever stop exploring," she said softly. "Just take me with you sometimes." Preston smiled, drawing her closer. "Always," he vowed. "Some journeys are meant to be shared." And as they sealed this promise with a kiss, Preston Hawkins, once a solitary cartographer mapping only external landscapes, embraced the greatest expedition of his life. The shared journey of two hearts that had found each other against impossible odds, guided by eyes that spoke volumes even when words failed. In the years that followed, as Montana moved toward statehood and Helena grew into a prosperous capital, Preston and Katherine Hawkins became respected figures in the community. Preston's maps helped define the new state's boundaries, while Katherine's educational innovations transformed territorial schools. They built a home on the outskirts of Helena, with windows that faced the mountains and open spaces where Preston could still feel the freedom he had once sought in constant movement. Their first child, a son they named Thomas after Katherine's father, arrived in the spring of 1882, followed 2 years later by a daughter, Elizabeth. Katherine continued teaching until just days before each birth, her dedication to education undiminished by motherhood. Preston, who had once thought himself unsuited to family life, discovered in fatherhood a joy he had never anticipated, the wonder of watching his children explore their world with the same curiosity that had driven his own wanderings. On summer evenings, Preston would often sit on their porch with Katherine beside him, their children playing in the yard, and marvel at how complete his life had become. The restlessness that had driven him for so long after the war had transformed into a different kind of energy, not a need to escape, but a desire to build, to contribute, to belong. "What are you thinking?" Katherine would sometimes ask, reading as always the subtle shifts in his expression. And Preston would smile, taking her hand in his. "That some chains free us while others bind," he would say. "And I'm grateful every day that I found you in the wrong kind so we could discover the right ones together." Katherine's amber eyes would shine with understanding, speaking volumes as they always had. From that first desperate moment beneath an abandoned wagon to this peaceful evening on their porch. No words needed, just the eloquent language of eyes that had seen suffering and joy, despair and hope, solitude and togetherness, and chose, every day, to speak of love.